Madeline Carter felt a sharp pull as a rough hand tightened around her arm. You think you can sit here? Lawson's cold voice cut through the silence. Madeline looked up, her gaze steady and unshaken. I haven't done anything wrong. Lawson smirked, his eyes glinting with amusement. I decide that. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Get up. Now. Madeline didn't move. Lawson suddenly shoved her shoulder. She staggered but quickly steadied herself. Who do you think will protect you? Then, take your hands off her. Now. A sharp voice cut through the air. Lawson froze, turning to face the person who had just spoken. And this was just the beginning. What happens next? Stay tuned, because the truth is about to unfold. The late afternoon sun cast a soft glow over the bustling city streets, but Madeline Carter, a black billionaire, chose a quiet corner to sit in solitude. Dressed in simple attire, she blended in effortlessly with the crowd, exactly as she intended. The journey to the top had never been easy. From the struggling neighborhoods of her youth, she had risen to become one of the most powerful business leaders in the world. Moments like this, sitting still, breathing in the rare silence, were few and far between in her relentless life. But peace never lasted long. Heavy footsteps echoed from the far end of the deserted street, the sound bouncing off the pavement, slow and deliberate. Madeline lifted her head, a chill prickling down her spine. A police officer was approaching, his eyes cold, his expression laced with thinly veiled contempt. Lawson, a name the community knew well, infamous for his brutality and unchecked authority. You think you can sit here? His voice was rough, laced with mockery. Madeline met his gaze, sensing the tension thickening in the air. She remained silent, her expression calm yet wary. This isn't a place to loiter. His tone was taunting, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. With undisguised prejudice. This is a respectable area, not for people like you. The words tightened something in Madeline's chest. She clenched her hands subtly beneath her coat. A slow, simmering anger stirred within her, but she refused to let it rise. Growing up the way she had, she knew how to face this kind of disdain without letting it shake her. I haven't done anything wrong, she said, her voice even but firm. I'm just sitting here for a moment. Lawson scoffed, the sound sharp and laced with amusement. You don't understand how things work around here, do you? I decide what's right and wrong. And the way you look sitting here, it's wrong. The weight of his words pressed against Madeline, but she held her ground. She knew she had to tread carefully, not let this escalate. But she also knew she couldn't let herself be pushed down simply because of his preconceived notions. Standing up to an officer like Lawson was never simple. She straightened her spine, meeting his gaze without flinching. You have no right to tell me I can't sit here. A flicker of irritation crossed Lawson's face, his jaw tightening. You think you're something special? Who? He stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with provocation. Maybe I should teach you a lesson about respecting authority. Madeline felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to break eye contact. She had faced countless obstacles in her life, but never had she been directly threatened like this, out in the open, in the middle of the street. Lawson moved another step closer, near enough that she could see the disdain in his eyes. She knew she had to be careful. Stand up. His voice was sharp, commanding. His right hand hovered near his holster, a silent warning. His eyes flickered across the empty street, as if searching for a witness to justify his intimidation. But there was no one. The air was thick, suffocating. I'm not violating any laws. Her voice was measured but unyielding. She didn't stand, not out of defiance, but because she knew she had the same rights as anyone else. Her anger burned beneath the surface, but she forced herself to stay composed. Any sign of fear or loss of control would only embolden Lawson further. He leaned in, his breath cold against the evening air. Who do you think you are? You think you're untouchable? Lips curled into a sneer. Anyone can be thrown into the back of a squad car if I say so. Madeline didn't respond. She just held his gaze. Her silence only fueled his frustration. He straightened, his face tightening with barely contained rage. Then, suddenly he shoved her shoulder. She stumbled but quickly regained her balance. The insult of it burned in her veins, her eyes flashing with fury. Fear curled in her stomach, but she refused to back down. Lawson's expression was cold, calculated. Madeline knew this was spiraling into something more dangerous, but she wasn't about to let him intimidate her into submission. She spoke, her voice low and firm, each word deliberate. "You have no right to do that." His hand shot out, gripping her arm roughly, yanking her toward him. "You think anyone here is going to protect you?" His voice was low, threatening. "Out here, I am the law." Madeline gritted her teeth as his grip tightened. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, but she refused to look away. She couldn't back down. She wouldn't. Then, a voice rang out behind them, sharp and commanding. "Take your hands off her. Now." Lawson whirled around, his face twisting in frustration and surprise. Standing behind him was Ethan Brooks. The officer's eyes flickered for a brief moment before returning to their cold, challenging stare. Lawson clenched his jaw, clearly displeased with the interruption. "Who the hell are you? This has nothing to do with you. Get lost." Ethan stepped forward, unfazed by the underlying threat in Lawson's tone. "I saw everything, and I won't stand by while she's treated unfairly." His voice was sharp but steady. His gaze met Madeline's, filled with empathy and unwavering resolve, a silent promise that she wouldn't have to face this alone. Lawson sneered, a fleeting smirk of defiance appearing on his face. "It's just a misunderstanding, sir," he drawled, feigning civility. "But I'd advise you not to interfere with police matters, unless you're looking for trouble." His grip on Madeline's arm remained firm, though his posture grew tense. Ethan held his stare. "I'll take that risk if it means protecting her rights." His voice was unyielding. "And if you think you can abuse your authority without being challenged, you're sorely mistaken." Madeline felt the pressure on her arm loosen slightly, but the tension in the air was far from gone. She glanced between Lawson and Ethan, a mix of gratitude and relief swelling in her chest. For the first time during this confrontation, she didn't feel alone. Lawson gritted his teeth, his words slow and deliberate. "I'll remember this." His eyes gleamed with barely restrained anger. He released Madeline and stepped back but made sure to send her a final warning glance. "But don't think this is over. You should be careful. You won't always have someone around to protect you." Ethan remained firmly in front of Madeline, his stance unmistakably protective. "We'll see who really needs to be careful, Officer Lawson." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Lawson turned on his heel and strode toward his patrol car, his steps heavy with frustration. Before getting in, he cast one last cold glance in their direction. Madeline took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tightness in her chest. She turned to Ethan, her expression composed yet filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly but sincerely. He nodded, his gaze softening but still resolute. "I couldn't just stand by and let that happen, Madeline. We need to make sure he's held accountable." She was silent for a moment, still feeling the lingering tension coursing through her veins. Ethan placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, a quiet reminder that she wasn't in this fight alone. But the relief didn't last long. A second patrol car pulled up, its red and blue lights flashing against the dark street. The glow illuminated the stern faces of two officers as they stepped out, their footsteps deliberate, their gazes devoid of sympathy. "You need to come with us." One of them spoke, his voice calm but firm. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Madeline gave a subtle shake of her head, her eyes steady. She knew she had to face this. She had to stay composed. Be ready for whatever came next. "Don't worry, Ethan," she said, keeping her voice level. "I'll be fine." His jaw tightened, concern flickering in his expression. "I'm calling a lawyer right now. Don't let them do anything until legal counsel is present, Madeline." She gave him a small but resolute smile, a silent reassurance. "I know." She stepped into the back of the patrol car, the chill of the metal seat seeping through her clothing, a stark reminder of the harsh reality she was about to face. The flashing streetlights reflected against the glass, casting fractured patterns across her face. But in her eyes there was no fear. Only determination. She sat straight, gazing out the window as the car pulled away toward the precinct. The city she knew so well, the streets, the buildings, suddenly felt unfamiliar. Upon arrival, the heavy clang of the car door shutting echoed in the cold, sterile silence. Madeline was escorted inside, the precinct's interior dim and unwelcoming. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh, unforgiving glare. The sharp scent of disinfectant made her wrinkle her nose. Beyond the interrogation room's door, the distant sounds of officers talking, keyboards clacking, and footsteps moving echoed through the station. But inside the room where she sat, everything was unnervingly silent. She settled onto the rigid metal chair, the chill biting through her skin. Her fingers rested lightly on the table, a faint tremor running through them as adrenaline still coursed through her veins. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself, refusing to give in to fear or anger. She thought back to the struggles of her past, the battles she had fought to prove herself, not just to society, but to herself. Those memories now served as a source of strength, fortifying her resolve. The door creaked open. Lawson entered, a cold, detached smile curving his lips. He lingered by the doorway for a moment before stepping forward, his gaze laced with quiet menace. "You think having someone stand up for you is going to change anything?" His voice was low, sharp as a blade slicing through the "You think you've won?" Madeline lifted her head, her gaze meeting Lawson's with unwavering resolve. Her heart was still pounding, but her voice remained steady. "I don't think I've won," she said, each word deliberate. "But I know this is just the beginning." Lawson's twisted smirk faded. His brow furrowed, tension thickening the space between them. Neither of them moved, neither willing to back down. Finally, he took a step back, his eyes burning with barely restrained fury. "You'll see soon enough who really holds the power here," he muttered. Then he turned on his heel and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him. Madeline sat still, listening as his footsteps faded down the hall. Silence settled over the room, but this time, it didn't feel suffocating. This time, it felt like the calm before a storm, one she was ready to face. She knew this fight was far from over, but she was no longer afraid. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching into eternity. Lawson's threat echoed in her mind, lingering like an unwelcome presence. But instead of fear, she felt something else rising inside her, a fire, a determination she refused to let die. This wasn't the first time she had been pushed down, and it wouldn't be the last time she stood back up. The door swung open suddenly. Madeline turned, her eyes locking onto Rebecca Hayes, a woman whose presence commanded attention, her sharp gaze cutting through the tension in the room. Behind her, Ethan stepped inside, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable but filled with quiet resolve. The dim hallway light spilled into the room, casting a faint glow around them, bringing with it a flicker of warmth, of hope. "Madeline," Rebecca said, her voice firm, carrying the weight of certainty. She pulled out a chair across from Madeline, setting down a black briefcase and flipping it open with practiced efficiency. Ethan took the seat beside Madeline, his concern evident, but his trust in her unwavering. "I spoke with Rebecca on my way here," Ethan said, his voice low but protective. "She's one of the best attorneys I know. We're not letting this go." Rebecca met Madeline's gaze head-on, her eyes sharp, unreadable. "We're taking down Lawson and anyone protecting him," she stated. "But first, I need to hear everything, start to finish. Don't leave anything out." Madeline drew in a deep breath, steadying herself, and then she told them everything. From the moment she had been sitting on the front steps, hearing the heavy footsteps approaching, to the way Lawson had loomed over her, dripping with arrogance and veiled threats. Every word carried the weight of injustice, every detail a reminder of the suffocating power wielded against her. Rebecca listened intently, her pen moving across the page in swift, precise strokes, capturing every word. When Madeline recounted the moment Lawson had shoved her, forcibly dragging her away under the pretense of authority, Rebecca's expression darkened, her grip on the pen tightening. Beside her, Ethan sat motionless, his fists clenched. Every word Madeline spoke only solidified his anger, his determination to see this through. Finally, Rebecca set her pen down, her voice steady but edged with steel. Lawson has a history of abusing his authority, she said. I've heard whispers about his overreach before, but no one has ever challenged him head-on. That changes now. Madeline nodded, exhaustion still clinging to her features, but the tension in her shoulders had lessened. What's our next move? Rebecca shut her notebook with a decisive snap. First, we file a lawsuit against Lawson and the police chief. We demand a full investigation into his conduct. And we don't stop there. We push to expose this as a systemic failure, not just one bad officer. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze locked onto Madeline. They won't go down without a fight, he warned. They'll smear you. They'll try to make this disappear before it even begins. For a long moment, Madeline said nothing. Then, slowly, she lifted her chin, her eyes filled with an unshakable resolve. I've faced their scorn my entire life, Ethan, she said, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. They can try to silence me, but I won't back down. This isn't just about me. This is for everyone who has been forced to stay silent. A rare smile ghosted across Rebecca's lips, an expression not of amusement, but of respect. Then we start now, she said. I'll contact the press. This case is going public. Lawson picked the wrong fight. The room fell into silence. But it was no longer the kind that suffocated. It was the kind that signaled the beginning of something unstoppable. A battle for justice. A reckoning that could no longer be ignored. News of Madeline's lawsuit against Lawson and the police department spread like wildfire, not just in the city but nationwide. Major newspapers, from respected print outlets to online social media platforms, covered the story of a black billionaire standing up against a notorious officer accused of abusing his power. Headlines like "Billionaire challenges the system" and "Madeline Carter leads the fight against police misconduct" flooded the media. In her office, Madeline stared out the window, sunlight casting a glow over the bustling city below. Yet, a heaviness lingered in her chest. She knew the real battle was only beginning. The sudden ring of her phone shattered the silence. Ethan's name flashed across the screen. She answered. His voice carried a mix of concern and tension. Madeline, have you seen the comments? We're getting a lot of support, but there's plenty of backlash too. I've seen them, Ethan. Her voice was calm, but exhaustion crept into her tone. On the computer screen before her, a relentless stream of comments scrolled by. Some hailed her courage, calling her a trailblazer in the fight against injustice. But others were harsher, questioning her motives, accusing her of exploiting the case for personal gain or to bolster her public image. Ethan sighed. This is just the beginning, Madeline. They're going to dig into your past, try to discredit you however they can. But you're not alone. Rebecca is ready to handle whatever they throw our way. She remained silent for a moment, watching the steady flow of traffic below. Memories surfaced, growing up in a struggling neighborhood, fighting to be recognized, defying those who dismissed her dreams. Those memories weren't just scars, they were her fuel. I know, Ethan. I've been preparing for this. Her gaze hardened. We're not backing down. Just then, a knock at the door. Rebecca entered, a thick folder in hand, her expression focused and resolute. Madeline, we need to talk. She got straight to the point, her voice unwavering. Today's press conference is crucial. This is our chance to take control of the narrative and make it clear why we're fighting. Madeline nodded. A flicker of tension passed through her eyes, but so did determination. I understand, Rebecca. We need to send a strong, clear message. Exactly. Rebecca placed the folder on the desk, flipping through a few pages. But be prepared for anything. The press will try to rattle you, question your intentions. Ethan took a seat beside Madeline, his expression unwavering in support. You're not alone. In this, Madeline. We're all here with you. She exhaled deeply, feeling the weight on her shoulders but also the strength of those standing beside her. This afternoon's press conference was her first step in addressing the public and setting the record straight. That afternoon, the press room was packed. Cameras flashed relentlessly, and the low murmur of hundreds of reporters created an air of tension. Madeline stepped up to the podium. Her heart pounded, but her gaze remained steady. In the corner of the room, Rebecca clutched the stack of documents, her eyes locked on Madeline, ready to step in if necessary. "Thank you all for being here today." Her voice rang out confidently through the microphone. The murmurs faded. Every eye in the room was on her. "I stand before you today not just for myself, but for every person who has been wronged and never given the chance to speak. Abuses of power cannot continue unchecked, and we must bring change." Immediately, reporters fired off questions, some supportive, others laced with skepticism. An older journalist stood, his tone edged with doubt. "Ms. Carter, do you truly believe this is about justice? Or are you simply using this case to enhance your personal brand?" Madeline met his gaze head-on, unwavering. "I have no need to enhance my brand, sir." Her voice was low, firm. "I've built everything I have through relentless work. What I'm doing today is not about publicity or profit. It's about dignity. It's about ending unchecked power, not just for myself, but for everyone who has been ignored." The room fell still. Every eye stayed on Madeline, not as a billionaire, but as a force of resilience and defiance. Across the room, Ethan gave a small, approving nod. Rebecca looked on, warmth in her expression. They knew they were on the right side of history. Madeline stepped out of the press conference room, exhaustion settling into every fiber of her being, yet her resolve remained unshaken. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the city. She realized that the words she had just spoken weren't merely to defend herself. They were meant to ignite hope for those who had never been given the chance to raise their voices. Ethan and Rebecca walked beside her. The three of them understood that the real battle was still ahead. As they entered the grand lobby of the building, a man in uniform was already waiting. The overhead lights reflected off the gleaming badge pinned to his chest, immediately catching Madeline's attention. Ethan shot a quick glance at the stranger, his posture shifting into quiet vigilance. Rebecca narrowed her eyes slightly, tightening her grip on the stack of documents in her hand. The officer stepped forward, his movements deliberate and measured. His face bore a mix of tension and determination. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter." His voice was low but firm. "I'm Officer Mark. I'm here because there's something important I need to tell you." Flicker of surprise crossed Madeline's face. Silence filled the space between them. Ethan took a slow, measured breath, studying Mark, trying to gauge his true intentions. Rebecca stepped forward slightly, her voice calm yet laced with caution. "We're listening, Officer Mark." Mark swallowed hard, as if summoning the courage to say what had been weighing on him. "I worked with Lawson for years. I know exactly who he is and what he's done." He hesitated, then continued, his voice heavy with regret. "I watched him abuse his power, targeting people who couldn't fight back. And I stayed silent, out of fear, out of pressure from above." A wave of emotions surged through Madeline. She understood how rare, and how dangerous, it was for a police officer to speak out against one of his own. She met Mark's gaze, her voice calm but cutting. "So what changed?" she asked, unable to hide the emotion behind her words. Mark exhaled, his expression clouded with remorse. "When I saw you stand up against that injustice, I realized I couldn't stay silent any longer. I couldn't keep looking the other way. What Lawson has done isn't just wrong, it has shattered the public's trust in people like us, the ones who are supposed to uphold justice." Ethan leaned slightly toward Mark, a glimmer of hope flashing in his eyes. "You understand that this could destroy your career, don't you?" Mark nodded, offering a tired but resolute smile. "I know. But if I don't do this now, I'll never be able to look at myself in the mirror without shame. Justice is worth the risk." Rebecca allowed a small, approving smile to surface, her sharp eyes reflecting newfound respect. "If you're willing to testify and give an official statement, this could change everything. We need all the support we can get to bring this case to light." Mark took a deep breath, locking eyes with Madeline, his gaze unwavering. "I'm ready. I'll provide whatever information you need and testify in court. I want the world to know the truth about Lawson and everything he's done. The air in the lobby seemed to still. A weighty silence filled the space, not one of tension, but of solidarity and shared purpose. A surge of emotion rose in Madeline. She knew that this wasn't just about confronting Lawson, this was about challenging an entire system. But now, she wasn't fighting alone. She was gaining strength from those willing to take a stand. Thank you, Mark. Her voice was low but sincere. You have no idea how much this means to me, and to so many others. Mark gave a faint smile, a rare warmth breaking through his usually hardened expression. Don't thank me. This is something I should have done a long time ago. As Mark left to make the necessary arrangements, Madeline turned to Ethan and Rebecca. The three of them exchanged a look of mutual understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement that they now had an ally on the inside. This was a pivotal moment in their fight for justice. We just gained a key ally, Rebecca said firmly. Now we need to move fast and turn this into legal action. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on Madeline's shoulder, pride evident in his expression. We're making a difference. And you're at the heart of it. Madeline looked out the window, where the streetlights were beginning to flicker on against the evening sky. A renewed sense of determination coursed through her, a belief that justice was no longer an unattainable ideal. With people like Mark stepping forward and allies standing beside her, she knew the truth was about to come to light. Outside, the crowd had been gathering for hours, reporters, supporters, and even skeptics. The hum of countless voices filled the air, a restless anticipation hanging over the scene. Camera flashes lit up the night, capturing every step Madeline took as she moved forward, her gaze steady, unshaken. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The seats were packed, journalists ready to broadcast every detail live, ordinary citizens who had followed the case closely through the media, and legal professionals watching intently. All eyes were fixed on the plaintiff's table, where Madeline and Rebecca sat. Ethan was right behind them, his face tense but radiating support. Then, Lawson entered. His expression was cold, his gaze sharp as a blade. But Madeline caught a flicker of unease in his eyes, a crack in the composed facade. He took his seat at the defense table, surrounded by his legal team, projecting confidence, yet failing to conceal the apprehension about how today's proceedings would unfold. Rebecca stood, stepping forward with quiet authority. Her gaze swept across the courtroom before settling on the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not just about a single incident. It represents a much larger issue. Within our system, she stated, her voice strong, unwavering. Madeline Carter is not just one victim, she stands for countless others, people who have suffered from abuses of power yet never had the chance to be heard. The jury listened intently. They were men and women from different walks of life, different ages and professions, but in this moment, they carried the same weight, the responsibility of delivering justice. A solemn stillness took hold of the room, an almost tangible pressure in the air. When Mark was called to the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He walked up with a steady stride, though his face bore the strain of the moment. His eyes flickered toward Lawson before settling on the jury. I worked with Lawson for years, he began, his voice firm. I witnessed his actions firsthand, the abuses of power I stayed silent about for far too long. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Mark recounted each instance in stark detail. Every story painted a damning picture. Lawson preying on the vulnerable, using excessive force where none was warranted. With every revelation, the room's tension deepened, and the jury's eyes grew sharper, more discerning. At the defense table, Lawson sat rigid, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Madeline noticed how his jaw tightened, his hands clenching unconsciously. She knew, truth was chipping away at his carefully constructed armor. Thank you, Officer Mark, Rebecca said, concluding her questioning. She turned to Madeline, her gaze steady and filled with conviction. This was the moment they had worked toward for so long, and she knew they had just gained crucial ground. Then, Lawson's attorney stepped forward. His smile was forced, his eyes sharp with calculation. Officer Mark, you worked with Lawson for years, he said, his tone laced with insinuation. Would you say you have any personal motivation for testifying against your former colleague? The attempt at doubt was clear, but Mark remained composed. His reply came without hesitation. My motivation is justice. The truth I ignored for too long. If I remain silent now, I become part of the problem. Behind him, Madeline felt her heart pound. She knew that every word Mark spoke was resonating, not just with the jury, but with everyone in the room. She caught the flicker of hope in Ethan's eyes. Rebecca gave a small, knowing smile, one of quiet encouragement and belief. The trial stretched late into the evening, filled with relentless cross-examinations and tense arguments. Lawson's lawyers fought to defend him, to justify his actions. But every time they tried to twist the narrative, Rebecca skillfully steered it back to the undeniable truth. Lawson had abused his power and had harmed Madeline, an innocent person. As the first day of trial ended, Madeline stepped out of the courtroom into the dimming afternoon light. The noise outside persisted, reporters, onlookers, conversations, but within her, something had shifted. Strength coursed through her veins. She had endured the worst and had stood her ground. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new challenges. But surrounded by those who believed in her, she knew justice was no longer just an impossible dream. The second day of the trial began beneath an atmosphere thick with expectation. As Madeline stood before the courtroom, she exuded confidence, though deep inside, anxiety still lurked in the corners of her mind. Outside, the murmur of voices was constant, a backdrop of tension composed of whispered discussions among the public and the frenzied voices of reporters scrambling to break the latest update. When she entered, she met Rebecca's gaze. The attorney was methodically reviewing her final notes, her presence a pillar of certainty. Beside her, Ethan carried a look of both resolve and apprehension. They exchanged a silent nod of reassurance. Today would be the ultimate test of their preparation, their sacrifices, and their courage. At the defendant's table, Lawson sat rigid, his posture carefully controlled. But his clenched fists betrayed him. His legal team murmured among themselves, eyes calculating, searching for a strategy to turn the tide. Rebecca stepped forward before the jury, her strong voice resonating through the silent courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is a stark reminder that power, when placed in the wrong hands, can become a weapon of destruction. But we are here to prove that justice prevails when the truth is brought to light. She turned, locking eyes with the jury, her gaze filled with unwavering determination. Today, we are not just holding one man accountable. We are affirming that this society will not tolerate the abuse of power. Her words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Glances were exchanged, a silent agreement spreading among the jury members. Across the aisle, Lawson's attorney struggled to maintain composure, but the initial confidence in their stance had visibly waned. They presented their final arguments, making a last-ditch effort to defend Lawson, but their reasoning no longer carried weight. Then, the jury was instructed to leave the room for deliberation. At that moment, every passing second stretched into an eternity. Madeline sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the clock hanging on the wall. Each tick of the second hand seemed to test her patience. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, a small gesture, yet it carried immense support. After hours of agonizing anticipation, the courtroom doors finally opened. The jury returned, and all eyes immediately turned toward their foreperson who held a piece of paper in hand. The air grew thick with tension. Everyone held their breath. We, the jury, find the defendant, Garrett Lawson, guilty on all counts. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Applause erupted, mixed with relieved sighs and hushed, emotional murmurs. Lawson sat motionless. His face drained of color, eyes wide in disbelief. His legal team huddled together, whispering frantically, but there was no escaping the verdict. A crushing weight lifted from Madeline's chest. She turned to Rebecca, who met her gaze with a calm yet victorious smile. Ethan stood, pride and emotion shining in his eyes as he looked at her. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had already gathered. As Madeline stepped out, a thunderous round of applause greeted her, rolling over like waves crashing onto the shore. Supporters encircled her, their faces filled with admiration. Camera flashes lit up the scene, capturing a moment the city would never forget. A young reporter, her voice trembling with emotion, stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Ms. Carter, do you have anything you'd like to say to everyone here today?" Madeline paused. Taking a deep breath, she looked out at the crowd before her, eyes shining with determination and gratitude. "Today, we proved that justice is not a privilege. It is a right for all. This is not just my victory. It is a victory for every person who has ever been ignored, silenced, or cast aside. I hope that from this day forward, no one will ever be afraid to raise their voice again." Applause thundered once more, filling her heart with relief and quiet joy. She turned to Ethan and Rebecca, both of whom smiled back at her. It wasn't just the feeling of winning, it was the validation that every struggle, every act of courage, had been worth it. After receiving congratulations and encouragement from the crowd, Ethan gently pulled Madeline aside to a quieter corner. "You did it, Madeline," he said, his voice warm, carrying both pride and tenderness. "You've made more of a difference than you realize." Madeline smiled, her eyes reflecting hope. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us," she replied, her tone filled with gratitude and sincerity. "But this is only the beginning. There's still so much work to be done to ensure justice is truly served." Rebecca stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with conviction. "And we will keep fighting. That's the one thing I am certain of." Madeline turned back to the crowd still gathered at the courthouse steps, waving and calling her name. They were proof of change, proof of the power of courage and an unyielding will. As she descended the courthouse steps, she felt the sun's warmth on her face, a reminder that no matter how difficult the path to justice might be, it was always within reach for those who refused to give up. And with each steady step, Madeline knew that a new journey had begun. A journey she and her allies would continue to write, through resilience, unwavering courage, and an unshakable pursuit of justice. If you were Madeline, what would you do? Have you ever faced injustice and had to stand up for yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story could inspire change and give strength to others. This isn't just about one person, it's about an entire system. Justice doesn't happen on its own, it takes people who are willing to speak up. Do you believe that one voice can make a difference? If this story resonated with you, share it with your friends and family to spread the message of courage and fairness. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared with the intention of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any mistakes, kindly overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.